All right, and welcome everybody back at another episode here. And this time we're going to cover group dynamics. Now, I know it's not the most thrilling name. I was actually kind of going back and forth on what exactly I wanted to call this. If I wanted to be more scientific, if I wanted to be more straightforward. Honestly, I could have just as easily called this whole presentation how to work in groups or working in groups, something to that effect. But I had to make it sound a little fancy. Don't know why, but it just is what it is. Hopefully, what you'll get out of this presentation is everything that you wish you'd learned about what it takes to actually successfully work in groups. A lot of people think it's, straightforward, as if there's some sort of like easy formula. And frankly, this can apply to anybody all the way from, high schoolers to teenagers to, young professionals like myself or career veterans. Really, this is very pivotal and foundational information that we'll be covering today about what it actually takes to effectively and successfully work in groups. So without further ado, let's get right into it. And, just as a disclaimer again, all the photos and whatnot that I have on here are not mine. If they are, I'll reference it as such. But I try to use Creative Commons photos as much as possible and no sponsors. All the work is my original own work, yada, yada, yada. So today, by the end, what you'll hopefully understand is actually being able to define and name all of the Tuckman's stages of group development, and we'll cover just exactly what that is. Um, we'll hopefully also be able to explain the different parts of the brain and what they do and their names. You'll understand how information travels to and from the brain. You'll be able to list some examples of physiological responses, and you'll also hopefully understand where and how to research more information on group dynamics and interpersonal relationships in order to help better educate yourself. This is not a one-stop shop and end all be all. This is meant really to provide you with a good, strong foundation so you can springboard and do your own research. So, just some really foundational stuff, right? When we talk about working and people in general, we're really referring to how it is that our brain functions, and how that in turn affects behavior and how environmental factors ultimately impact formations in the brain, all the way from infancy to adolescence to adulthood. All of those stages of development have a critical impact on the development of the brain. And really, the way that our brain communicates with our body and vice versa, our body with our brain, is through two main parts, what we call central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. So the CNS is our information highway where we have our spinal cord, which is going right up to the brain, and the brain can send signals down there. And then from the spinal cord, we have the PNS, which is nerves branching and reaching to the other extremities of the body. So basically, it's like think of a tree trunk and the branches and leaves. It's exactly the way it's designed the same way. Now, different types of stimuli activate and engage different parts of the brain, and of course, that in turn activates various physiological responses. So, what do I mean by physiological responses? Sweating, increased muscle blood flow, increased adrenaline, constricted pupils, heart racing, right? Uh, these are things that what signals our brain sends directly impacts our physical responses. And of course, we can also have these physiological responses be activated depending on the environmental stimuli around us, right? So if there's danger about that can trigger certain physiological responses, namely higher adrenaline, so on and so forth. And the really fascinating thing in human psychology is that even though we have the same four core responses to stimuli, which are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, we're all familiar with fight, flight, and a lot of us might have heard freeze just for the first time, and it's exactly what it sounds like. There's an external stimuli, usually in nature. We might see this typically when there's a predator attacking a prey, and it's futile for the prey to really do anything else to escape the situation. So all it does is it simply, accepts the fate that has befallen it, and quite literally the muscle response goes totally uh, it just goes right out the window. In other words, they're not tensing up, they're not getting ready to run. They quite literally almost turn sort of the jello, and they have no control of over their muscle reactions. Fawn is another one. And just to back up for a second for the freeze response, really what you can also see the freeze response in situations where somebody has an increased level of anxiety. Typically, what that means is they've had some sort of negative experiences that are very similar to the one happening just now. It might be that the environment is physically the same, but there's different individuals involved. And a lot of times the anxiety level will rise so much so that they will quite literally just freeze in place and they won't respond with anything. Physically, they're just sort of, they might stand upright, but they're not moving, and they might be experiencing, cold sweats. So that's a physiological response in addition to their physical response of freezing. Um, Fawning is another type of behavior. It's actually quite common to see with infants, especially when you look at puppy dogs and how they behave around older adult dogs, where a lot of the times it's appeasement behavior where you're fawning in order to get a desired response from somebody else, and oftentimes though it's because there's a negative stimuli awaiting if you a negative response awaiting if you don't take this appeasement approach. So oftentimes you'll see puppy dogs licking and grooming adult dogs and in times that they know they've been particularly annoying and particularly frustrating, and they can see the adult dog is ready to snap at them, rightfully so. And so what do? They try to diffuse the situation by appeasing and fawning. Humans also do this too. A lot of times it's comes out subconsciously where they will say things that they might not even have recollection of saying, or they will do things to appease another party because they either perceive, and it's important, a lot of these responses can be both from a perceived point of view where it's not actually happening, but in their brain, the signals are no less stronger, and they're very much real within the brain as well as the body. That something of similarity has happened previously in their life is also happening now, but it's not actually happening now. It's just maybe some commonalities are present. Say, there was a negative experience they might have faced in a particular park, and they're back at that same park. However, you know, not the same people are not present. They're surrounded by friends and family and loved ones, and it's at a birthday party. Yet, whatever negative experience they might have had just so happen to occur at that park. Yet that triggers a appeasement or fawning response, so they'll behave in a certain manner that they towards an individual or a collective group of individuals that they otherwise normally would not be responding to that way. Um, and as it states there, it's really a subconscious safety-seeking response, and it's trying to predict what it is that the other person might want or need in order for you to feel safe, not so much that there's actually any sort of threat present. And that's the fascinating thing about the nervous system and the brain and physiological responses. They occur, these various signals and responses occur regardless of whether something's actually happening or not. Different people have different thresholds for what they're able to tolerate, and as well as what they're able to sort of rebound back from, right? Where some people, if they've had a particularly negative experience, they have a different propensity to really come back from it. Some might come back stronger, others not so much. And so it's important to realize that all the four core responses to stimuli are there, right? Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The spectrum is people's ability to sort of handle the different stimuli, and not just in the moment, but afterwards as well. How they cope, how they manage, worldviews they might develop, behaviors, other adaptations they might have that otherwise would not have kicked in before the uh, incident occurred. And so the nervous system, right? So we talked about the two communication highways where brain, spinal cord, and tree trunk, and then branches, the PNS, peripheral nervous system, right, branching out. So uh what are the areas of the brain that sort of handle these different tasks in communicating with different parts of the body, and how they impact different parts of the body depending on what signals? So we really have three core parts. We have the cortex, and of course, there's a uh, prefrontal cortex, and there's different parts of the cortex as well. We have, which handles primarily intellectual tasks. So things like analytical, you know, planning, very logical sequencing. Those types of things is what our cortex is responsible for. We have our reptilian part of our brain, which is really instinctual behavior. And then we also have our limbic system, which regulates and manages emotional behavior. The fascinating thing about the brain, of course, it's evolved over millions and millions of years, and without exception, everybody has these three parts. There are obviously instances where somebody might have deformities with a certain part, or they're slightly smaller, and another part might be slightly bigger than normal, and those definitely impact not only people's propensity to handle certain stimuli, but overall behaviors and various other medical conditions that potentially might come with it. But really, what I want you to take away from this slide is there's such a common, very common, and false belief that every decision that we as humans make is always purely rational and logical. And this is not the case whatsoever, because it implies that essentially we only have one part to our brain, and it's the cortex, and the brain is just only made up of our cortex. And if that were the case, then humans would really have little to no emotion or irrational behavior whatsoever. We would be thinking purely like a machine, which empirically we know is absolutely wrong. And I can't tell you how many times, not only from coworkers, I've seen this, but also other fellow instructors who truly do believe and live in this manner that all human behavior is purely coming from a rational and logical perspective, and it is never the case. It is why a lot of the conversations around how STEM innovates and how we can make technologies better exclusively for the vast majority of time, and by vast majority of time I don't mean 51% or 60%. I'm talking like 90 to 95%, right? So that 5% difference of where people do take into account is totally negligible, because there's such a bigger percentage at play here that totally disregards the fact that the human brain is not just this purely analytical and logical um, entity. It does, in fact, have various parts to it, and rightfully so. They serve a different purpose, and it's not like one is better than the other. Humans have always been, forever will continue to be social creatures. And what I want you to get again out of this is that context is always important. Um, Different internal from person to person, right? And external environmental stimuli will absolutely affect and engage different parts of the brain. For some people, a particular stressor, immediately they have a higher propensity to look at it from a analytical perspective, whereas others will have a more emotional perspective, and others will have a more gut instinctual perspective, namely fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. That's very, very important. And it's why, depending on the folks that you work with, depending on not only their own career backgrounds, but their types of personalities that they might have, different hobbies and interests and perspectives and values they hold, that absolutely plays a role in how their nervous system operates versus your nervous system, and what they respond to positively versus yours. This is really what I'm really trying to do here is shift the age-old approach of attitudes and platitudes to neuroscience and legitimate evidence-based frameworks. And it all comes from understanding the nervous system and the human brain. Another key takeaway here is really most human behaviors actually occur subconsciously. At the very least, the primary ones that result in our being able to live. So things like your breathing, your resting heart rate are all driven by your reptilian brain. So these are what we call egoic behaviors. And again, you might have heard the word ego, which is a lot of subconscious values and behaviors that you really don't automatically have full control over and full understanding over um, just off the gate. People need to actually be actively coached, taught, and help in order to assisted in order to adapt away some of the negative responses they have in order to actually learn more positive and pro-social manners of interacting. So it's why you might see people saying silly nonsense or behaving in irrational manners. And most of the time, it does in fact come from subconscious behaviors, from the ego, from their reptilian part of their brain. And it's primarily because they haven't really um, worked through uh, understanding some of those behaviors and how different stimuli activate different parts of their brain and what they have a tendency to respond towards. It is people have, we're born with an innate propensity and ability for the most part to master and learn to manage and adapt these behaviors and systems, but the vast majority of people do not have that, innate ability to just do so without any sort of uh, coaching or assistance off the gate. Most people do in fact need it, and it's not just a one-off, you take one workshop and you're done. It's over many, many, many years. And in fact, when you look at uh, develop development in humans from childhood to teenagehood to young adulthood, there's different stages that they that there's different parts of their brain that they're able to more closely relate with. And a common thing that you see very often with children is that they're very strongly tied to their egoic behaviors. It's oftentimes a very uh, self-focused manner of being, where only their perspective is being taken into account, and also they rightly justify their own behaviors because they feel a need. They don't really know where that need or want comes from, but they feel it, and so therefore they innately, automatically act on that need and on that want. These are the types of things that people learn bit by bit through development, but there's more fine tuning to be done as you enter the age of adulthood, as different parts of your brain further develop, as you're able to understand uh, things like consent and what that means to be able to express and give consent for an adult versus uh, a young adult versus somebody in their, late 30s versus 40s versus 50s. And for a lot of people, actually, the brain as a whole doesn't really fully form and finish developing until their late 20s, which is really to say that specifically the ability to understand and manage a lot of these egoic behaviors really doesn't that full ability doesn't really kick in until we're about 27, 28. And as humans are living longer, that age is being pushed back ever so slightly. And so it's a very important thing to take into account that a lot of these subconscious behaviors, people aren't really um, being able to take full action to understanding them because the brain is not quite yet fully formed. And so they have a higher propensity. It doesn't mean they all. So the difference here, right? I want to stress the importance of propensity, which is, the ability which is a potential to act on something, but it doesn't it's not a guarantee that you're always going to act in that particular manner. You just might have a higher likelihood, but it's not a guarantee. So that's what I mean when I say propensity. So the information highway, right? We talked about the CNS and we talked about the PNS, and this is just giving you a more holistic overview of really how that looks like in the body, right? We talked about physiological responses before, and really these are from our parasympathetic nerves, right? So we talked about constricting pupils or dilated pupils. We talked about inhibiting another physiological response could be, inhibiting glucose, especially in particularly stressful situations. You'll find people have higher levels of adrenaline, and adrenaline does and has certain impacts on the body. Uh, Regardless of it's actually a life or death situation. Again, going back to perceived versus real actual events. The important takeaway from this photo, aside from just showing you various other um, physiological responses as well as the architecture of our nerves themselves, which you see here on the right hand photo, is what the brain explicitly cannot remember as memories, the body, in fact, does. So, this is what I meant by that example where, say, you're walking about your local park. Maybe 10 years ago, you had a negative experience, right? An apple could have fallen out of the tree and hit you so hard on the head it just kind of clonked you out for a minute, and then you woke up, you weren't sure what happened, but let's just say that really influenced you in a deep, deep manner. And now 10 years, fast forward 10 years, you're walking by that same park, and it happens to be that you're coming up to the tree where this, ginormous, ungodly apple fell on your tree and clonked you out. um, as you're approaching the tree, you'll find that even though you intellectually and your brain might not have been able to store that memory, to you it's just another tree and it's just another apple. Your body senses that it's the same spot with the same type of apples that hurt you in this particular manner all those 10 years ago. And so our physiological responses actually often occur unconsciously through the body. And it goes both for positive and negative experiences. And As for what our body does and does not remember, unfortunately, we have no control over that. But what we can do is we can actually help the body sort of unlearn the potentially negative manners of being, and instead learn new ways of adaptation. And a lot of this is where we tap into using both not just our reptilian brain, but also our cortex to help intellectually and logically train our bodies through various frameworks. You know, one manner of which is you can help somebody be re-exposed to the same stimuli in a very controlled and safe manner. Right, in this case, you might just have somebody sort of circle the tree a couple of times. You might even have them wear a really strong, industrial safety helmet as they're walking by that, just so their body learns that, this particular stimuli is not negative all the time, right? And, generally too, our brain and body does in fact have a bias, a stronger bias for remembering negative stimuli. And the reason for this is an evolutionary, biological reason for survival. And for better or for worse, it is what it is that, our brains and bodies behave this way through, you know, uh, um, years and years and years of evolution. It's something that has clearly allowed us to survive and adapt for the better, to have the ability to sort of remember stimuli in this manner. And by remember, I use it loosely, of course, because I'm talking about subconscious memory. So that was a lot. I just wanted to throw that all out there. And really, what I wanted to take away from all of that, from talking about brain development, the different parts of the brain, how information gets to and from our brain and our body, how our body remembers things that our brain really might not, is neuroscience is vastly important, and it goes hand in hand with social psychology, and it goes hand in hand with understanding current events, historical events, as well as culture and ways in which people interact and behave individually versus collectively, and especially more so when it's a group collaboration, you know, the way that they interact with certain folks versus other folks, regardless of the fact that they're, still in a group environment. And what it really means is a lot of the pre-existing culture impacts every facet of how work is done, individually and collectively. And past experiences, as we've just learned, absolutely do shape the present through subconscious behavior and thoughts. The important takeaway here is that these subconscious behaviors and thoughts are just that. They're subconscious. It means we can't just automatically think them away and they go away. It is exactly why um, somebody, it's exactly why somebody that might be experiencing certain physiological responses associated with a fight or flight, life or death situation, even though they're currently not in that same situation, they're in fact, at a water cooler, for example, it doesn't matter. Perception of stimuli is just as real, both to the brain and the body, as the very event itself when it did in fact happen. It's very, very important takeaway here. Further, just as important is, it does not mean that they cannot be changed. These subconscious behaviors and thoughts can in fact be changed. Responses to ideas, are you open-minded, and are you able to at least entertain them and to explore them without a feeling of threat of attacking who you are as a person and what you stand for? Can you tolerate differences in behavior? Say, you have a Knicks fan versus a not Knicks fan, and can you tolerate them within a group environment? What sort of biases do you have, right? Explicit biases are ones that we're conscious of and we apply them, versus implicit ones are subconscious. And a lot of times, it comes up and we only know after the fact, but while it's happening, we're not really aware of it. It doesn't mean though that these things cannot be changed, and it doesn't mean that even though somebody might have a higher propensity to do something or might have a lower propensity to be resilient, it doesn't mean that they cannot be resilient. And it does not mean that their behaviors cannot be changed and adapted in a positive and pro-social manner. It just means really it takes work. You can't just think your way out of it. It takes lots of dedicated work. And again, the vast majority of people really operate in an egoic and subconscious manner. And what that means is whenever, say, an idea comes about, instead of seeing it for what it is as just simply an idea, right? They see it quite literally as a visceral attack on who they are as an individual and what their values are, their friends, family, loved ones. Quite literally, they see it in that and experience it in that visceral, physical manner. So they have, responses to ideas that somebody else would not have, and they, have a higher propensity to be negative. This is where it gets interesting. There's so much that I could really say here, but the thing of it all is when we talk about management, leadership, and neuroscience, it matters. It used to be the case people thought a manager could be a leader de facto, and a leader could be anybody, especially more so if they were the stereotypical archetype of a charismatic and loud and boisterous speaking person, that as if somehow that automatically made them a suitable leader, and it does not. And I'm gonna explain to you exactly why. Management and leadership are using totally different parts of the brain, and the cool thing is that anybody can manage. And predominantly it's because these are tasks that involve heavy use of executive and cognitive functions. Again, we talk about analytics, right? Logic, sequential planning, right? Step one, step two, step three. These are things that most people can do, and we actively all learn how to do throughout our entire years of schooling, especially at home. We learn everything from how to make our bed, how to cook, how to put on our shoes, right? How we get in our car, go to work. We learn these things, and they don't really take a lot of times, much thought other than putting together all the pieces in logical sequence. Leadership, on the other hand, actually totally uses, again, a different part of the brain, and it's actually localized in the limbic system. And it requires heavy use of intuition, motivation. I would add to here as well dedication and commitment, because motivation can be fleeting, whereas if you have a routine and if you are committed and show discipline, that is more than just a fleeting feeling. That is shown to be time proven, consistent, regardless of what the environmental circumstances are. So leadership takes discipline, management does not, and it involves using other skills. Leadership uses a lot of social and emotional processes. And really, I want to stress here that it's more than just being emotional, right? And it's also more than just being boisterous and the stereotypical, domineering and boisterous type of personality. You need an effective leader can actually use emotional intelligence specifically for the purposes of proactively communicating to effectively help not just themselves, but other people by building trust, managing conflicts, exploring ideas without taking it so personally that they feel it's an attack and a threat to their individual selves and their way of being in life itself. Managers, again, uh, who are used to doing the traditional management tasks do not have many instances where they are really challenged to exercise that part of their brain, quite literally. It just they're often in an environment where they don't really have a need to, and so that's the way the brain works, right? It's exactly in that you need to exercise that part of the brain in order to learn and adapt. You can't, we have the innate ability to develop and grow, but it does not mean that by default we're born with these skills. We have to really train, be taught through repetition, through experiences to effectively use them. And that's really what makes the difference. And you can't just be a manager or a leader. You have to learn how to effectively be both, which is to say you really need to do the long and arduous work of emotional regulation, understanding your propensities and preconceptions, explicit and implicit biases, and understand how your nervous system operates with certain stimuli and give you certain physiological responses and exploring why that is. And many people do not do that. And it's why that adage exists where anybody can be a manager, but not everybody can be a leader. Uh, it's also the case with leadership is a lot of the folks that do make very effective leaders have this intrinsic desire, um, this internal locus that drives them to be of help to others. And not only that, but they have this th this pull. They don't just do it for the sake of getting self-gratification exclusively. There is some level of self-gratification they have, but they do it primarily because they want to learn how to be of more help to other people and how and they use that oftentimes as a way to learn more about themselves, which innately is more than just the fleeting feeling of gratification, but also builds them up as an individual through various skills that they learn. They also unlearn, they might unlearn some negative responses and behaviors, and through this exploration, they learn new ways of adaptation. Um, so very, very wonderful and wonderful and powerful stuff here when we talk about how neuroscience really is at the foundation of management and leadership, truly. Something of equal importance here is yes, we've learned so far people can change, people can unlearn you all on its own. But there are, in fact, cases and instances where, unfortunately, it really doesn't matter how how much effort and resources others um, or your environment fosters to help people learn some of these positive ways of being and learning things like this, how our brain is formed and whatnot. And particularly, I'm referring to character disturbed individuals where regardless if they have a formal diagnosis or not, a lot of people want to instantly jump into, well, do they have a clinical diagnosis of a personality disorder? It does not matter. Truly, it does not matter. When I refer to individuals who are character disturbed, specifically, again, it doesn't matter if they have a formal clinical diagnosis, but I'm talking about repetition and of behavior and a pattern that follows. especially a pattern regardless of the environment they are in. And people that, if they're in in particular environment, they have a drive to, instead of help other people and learn more about them, they have a drive to sort of manipulate, control a situation. And then they're, say, in another situation where they are given a lot of freedom and power to do basically anything they wish, and instead of, again, learning more about their subconscious ways of being and how different stimuli affect them, they double or triple down on that same controlling and manipulating behavior. This is how we get really terrible misapplication and total misunderstanding of pro-social management and leadership methods. This is how we get complete misinterpretation and disregard of individual and collective group behaviors, right? They apply the same pattern of behavior regardless of the environment. Oftentimes, you'll see this expressed as platitudes, very vapid behavior, self-centeredness, a lot of hypocritical remarks. And really what it does is it serves to mask their own character deficiencies, their own weaknesses, and they often do this in a relentless pursuit of self-fulfillment at the expense of others, knowing too very well that they don't have to follow this path, but they do so anyway. And again, the importance here is that regardless of whether there's a clinical diagnosis or not, it's the pattern of behavior, regardless of the environment, is consistent and the same. That's the important takeaway here. So, moving on. All right. So, we're coming up now on the part which I like to say, so we have our building blocks. We know about the brain. We know how different things might impact our brain and our body. We learn a little bit about cases where some people just, are really sort of beyond help and, might actively or, subconsciously at least be refusing to adapt and change. Um, all that stuff is good, but that's really focused on the individual. This is the part of the presentation that we actually talk about the group. So, with that in mind, who is Dr. Bruce Tuckman? So really, to make a long story short, he developed what's called the Tuckman stages of group development, and it shows the phases that people go through when they come together in groups. As long as there's more than one person within the same vicinity, that's a group. Multiple people, right? More than one, you have a group. Also, we'll see a slide coming up here to show you those phases of the groups. What I want you to remember is that these stages do not happen in sequential order. It is not necessarily the case that they happen in a logical, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 set of steps. It does not happen that way. Oftentimes, what actually happens is you jump from one to another. It's exactly like when we refer to the stages of grief. Um, some people might never actually come out of one stage. Same thing happens here. Um, some people might go from one to, and progress to another, but then they revert right back to that previous phase. Or some people might skip certain phases altogether and, sort of jump to the end. It is totally not guaranteed that you sort of go through each of the steps in a nice, perfectly logical, sequential manner. Very important. Most people don't get that. So just want to be very, very important and clarify that. And really the stages, um, oh, and also if a new member comes in, or even if an existing member leaves the group, same thing. The group, even though they're at a particular stage, they might very well jump back to to yet another completely different stage, or they might say forever be stuck in that stage or they're currently at, um, until somebody, again leaves. Internal factors or external forces impact the group. These really, though, give you the ground to understand just how it is that people behave in groups. These are the stages that human beings go through when interacting in groups, and we'll see that in the photo here. So we have forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning, and I'll actually explain. So with norming, there's actually sort of an iterative process there, but think of this, if it helps you remember the visual, aside from the cool naming convention. Honestly, I don't know how he came up with something that rhymes and goes so well, but think of if you've ever seen hens and chicks, think of the pecking order. This is exactly what that's like, except given more concrete verbiage. So a lot of people like to think of, going from one. So if we were to give these a number, call forming one, storming two, norming three, performing four, adjourning five. There's really two iterative steps you do at norming. There's norming and renorming. So if that helps you, you know, in put it in a logical sequence, there it is. But really, what we have at the beginning here is forming, which is exactly how it sounds like. People are meeting either for the first time or they're people that are familiar with each other. And they learn about, really, this is where they're learning about the opportunities and challenges of what the group is being called to do, right? Here is where they agree to work on goals and actually then set out to do the work. Oftentimes what you find when people are at this stage is they're very motivated to do the work, but they're not really a collective group unit just yet. They're really working independently and, together but separate sort of thing where, again, they're physically together, or in another, in modern times, they might be a remote group, but they're really behaving independently, right? Which is to say, they have their own silos of work that they do, um, and there might be reluctant to share some of that information. It's really nothing to do with direct personal uh, views of the group per se or any one individual, but it's primarily because they're unsure of what they're expected to do, or they might just be uninformed of some of the issues at hand, what the objectives might be, expectations not only of them, but of the team. So that's really where people are at in this particular phase. And now, if they've made it through this phase successfully, um, then really what you have, and really typically forming, unless there's a new person being added, that's typically the only time that folks might be stuck in this particular case, right? Is there another human body being added to this collective? If not, then, they usually progress beyond this phase. And next up, we have what's called storming. And here what we have is, conflict is arising as power and status are being assigned, right? Depending on what dominance hierarchy is chosen. If it's a top-down type of structure, all that is important. And here you see people voicing individual opinions. Work might be done in the form of trust building exercises to build trust with among teammates. Some people might feel like a lot of excitement. Others might be really eager to, get ready and keep going and, crank out work. Um, they might be just overall really positive. But on the other hand, a lot of people might just as equally feel suspicion, a lot of fear and anxiety. And this really all goes back to the fact that people have different propensities to adapt and manage different stimuli differently. It really depends on the individual and what their experiences are. You know, You might oftentimes in this this is where a lot of disagreements and personality clashes arise. And honestly, some groups might never actually progress out of this stage. It's your job as a leader really to describe the tasks, better understand behaviors, and help your team also understand the behaviors of their respective teammates, and then ultimately teach others and how to deal and handle complaints, as well as you asserting your your appropriate authority to manage and deal those and handle those complaints. Something you're find in this phase is, tolerance and patience are really your keys to success. Um, just as the old adage says, sometimes you have to ride the storm out. It's really no different in this case. If you're able to make it through that and get to the next part, which is what I like to call our iterative part of this whole cycle, it's what we call norming. This is where people begin to express more tolerance and acceptance of personalities and behavioral quirks of their respective team members. And it's all with the active effort of moving on, to accomplish a common goal. It's really important to take away here is that some people might be really hyper focused on preventing conflict as opposed to um, to the degree that they're actually sometimes avoiding conflict altogether. And there is a time and place to avoid conflict as an active, conflict management practice. But in this case, what I'm talking about is regardless of what the instances, you might see people actively choosing conflict avoidance always, regardless of what the circumstances are. So just be mindful of that. Um, and oftentimes what you can get here as norms or cultural and behavioral norms are being set and agreed upon by the team and being worked through. You might have a reluctancy of sharing ideas and feedback, especially if people are reluctant to address conflict or actually dive into a group effort with conflict, because conflict does in fact drive uh, can drive innovation and disrupt a stagnation of work and ideas overall. So conflict is not inherently always bad. It's just there's a difference in views and of opinions, and it needs to be reconciled in some manner. Sometimes that means you avoid it, and there's not always a perfect solution, although people have a stronger tendency to want some sort of best solution, myself included. But it's really helping educate people that sometimes that might not be the case, and there might never be a perfect solution, and just helping people understand that and working through that, not only what it means for them individually, but for the group collectively. Then we get to my personal favorite, performing, right? Where we worked out a lot of these cultural differences and we understand each other on a deep and intimate level. And now we're really just getting straight to the work. We're grinding it out. Roles are defined, expectations are set. There's a common and clear goal. The team is motivated, they're knowledgeable not only about what they're doing, but they feel confident in their expertise. Uh, and really, at this point, they're often autonomous. They are self-organized, they're self-driven, they know who they need to contact to get to get access to a particular resource, all that good stuff. Things we all want to see from our teams. Sometimes and when people are really doing the work, so dissent is allowed, especially sometimes it's encouraged if channeled through the appropriate means. that the team might have agreed upon during norming, right? If there's an issue that comes up with the work itself or an issue with a particular team member, say something is going on with that team member at home and it's impacting the way that they are um, working in the workplace, you know, we can address that at this point in an appropriate manner, and we channel it through appropriately rather than having no sort of channel communication to address that. We get to the iterative part as we're, doing work. Really, we're going to find that what we established before as norms was a function of what we knew today. So what that means is that we are back to really norming and renorming again. For example, there might be an instances where a team or even the team leader is being too content with subpar performance levels. Obviously, this prevents the team from reaching their full potential and actually achieving objectives. So readdressing that, sometimes that might be an actual, team member bringing up the issue as opposed to the team lead. At this point, people feel confident enough to bring up these issues and without a fear of retaliation or without a fear of there's going to be some sort of negative consequence if they address this cultural norm that seems to be setting in of accepting subpar performance. And then the really the true final phase is the work is complete, and the group ultimately needs to be disbanded, right? There was a task at hand, it was completed within a certain timeline, and like any project work, right? It's unique in it's also time bound. There's definitive start and stop time. Um, Oftentimes what you find in this phase, and it doesn't necessarily mean that these people will never work together as a group, but the fact that the group came together for achieving a particular task, right? That was a unique task. Project work is unique. So while they might come together again for other work, it's not going to be the same, and that's okay. That's to be expected. But it doesn't mean that unsameness is bad. It just means it's just that. It's not the same as it was before. You're not making the same widget in this time around. So that's okay. Oftentimes, what you'll find as you are going through the adjourning phase with your team is it can actually lead to a lot of depression and anxiety. Naturally, again, people are social creatures, so they're always wanting to connect, and in this case, reconnect with their team leads. Sometimes, though, a permanent adjourning of that team is best because those people are really just rode the wave and completed the work and never want to see each other, and that's fine too. It's not the case that they have to see each other and be on good buddy terms. It's just a natural part of adjourning. Um, so there you have it. Those are Tuckman stages of group development and what every human experiences whenever they're working in groups of people. And again, just remember, it's not that teams go from forming, storming, directly to storming, directly to norming, directly to performing, then directly to norming and renorming, and then immediately to adjourning. Oftentimes you'll find team forms, they immediately jump to performing, task gets done, adjourned. No unspoken norms and cultural ways of interacting as a group are set. That's okay too. It's not set in stone that you need to go through all these phases in a distinct and explicit manner for a team to be effective. But they do go through these stages, and how it looks like for them, will be very unique to the circumstances and individuals who are involved in the actual making of the group. But they do go through these stages. whether explicitly or implicitly. On this slide here, what I wanted to give you is just a really nice list of social scientists that have helped frame a lot of the scientific understanding of how humans interact in groups, both from understanding humans as individuals and as well of seeing how people interact as groups. A lot of these folks and many of their counterparts have done research from observing infants, right, to adolescents, teenagers, young adults, etc. And probably some of the more common names we've seen are, if not the scientists themselves, well, many people have definitely heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We'll be covering that in the upcoming slide here. Um, that was by, of course, Abraham Maslow. There's also Frederick Hertzberg, and we talk about the hygiene factors and motivating agents for people in the workplace. There's also McGregor with this theory X and 3Y. Weechee was actually an American social scientist who really kind of added a very much needed part to McGregor's sort of very binary view of the world and talked about a theory Z. Philip Crosby, we've covered him in a another session with what is quality management. His whole thing was quality is free, right? We have the plan, do, check, act, which is very sequential, traditional waterfall, right? You plan everything up front and then you do everything according to the plan. There's also the Pareto principle. I believe this guy was an Italian scientist. 80-20 rule. 80% of the problems are caused by 20% of the things. 80% of the revenue is coming from 20% of the customers, that sort of thing. One of my personal favorites, Joseph Juran, change, real lasting change, comes from all aspects of the dominance hierarchy, above, below, horizontally, and across. So you need all. And then, of course, we have another very interesting tidbit called Parkinson's Law, which is to say that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. So if you have a month for doing something, even though that task might actually just take you, a week and a half, it's not going to take you the full month to do. And it's especially important when we talk about agile ways of project management. So really cool stuff. So again, some of these guys we've covered. You can check the session on what is project management, as well as what is quality management. And on to the next one. So really, really cool thing. When we talk about Maslow's hierarchy or needs, we're talking about the individual. So just, to sort of frame your brain for a second. We talked a little earlier about physiological responses. So really at the base of this triangle of needs is physiological needs for basic biological survival: food, water, shelter. Safety needs, right? Security, safety. Are you in active harm, right? Are you working in a place where the situations always call for a life or death instance? We have psychological needs. This is sort of shifting both to individual and collective. Really, this entire triangle applies to the individual as well as the group. But these are things like, are you able to have some sense of accomplishment, reward, as well as being in an environment that fosters and allows and enables you to actively share ideas without you always feeling like you're walking on eggshells or reluctance, right? And at the top, we have self-fulfilling needs, which is self-actualization of, you have this innate drive, say, to sort of quote unquote want to change the world, but you want to do it in a way that is unique to you. And some people, might be an artist, other people, they might be building, hybrid diesel engines that run on electric batteries, and they want to do it for cheap, and they want to do it in a sustainable manner, with open source hardware and software. Really depends on the individual, but somebody that's self-actualized understands that not only understands that these are their drives, but they understand how to effectively work with others in a pro-social and positive manner to make it happen where it's mutually beneficial. Really, the key takeaway from this is I just want to show folks that, one cannot effectively channel their energy and efforts into productivity without first getting their basic needs met. Regardless of if it's the workplace, personal, home and family life, or really anywhere else, if there's no physiological um, basic needs, food, water, shelter, you're not going to be focused on, achieving peak software engineering performance and cranking out the most lines of code with high quality code at every point in turn. It's just not possible if your organization is completely downturning, and say there's really not no other employers in your area, and you have family and kids to feed. You're not thinking about being the best elite level solutions architect on the particular project. If you are in an environment that is actively, saying one thing but doing quite the opposite, we're open to ideas, and they completely shut down every idea. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that a particular task needs to be done. Folks are just not going to be uh, connected to that and able to perform because those basic needs are not met. I would also add in this, it's a little outdated image. I wish I'd found a better one, but those basic needs really include psychological needs as well. Self-actualization is something that people grow into and learn over time. But what people need truly are achieving, or being in a place that achieves the psychological as well as physiological basic needs for safety. So here we have the motivation hygiene and dual factor theory. This is from Hertzberg. And so really what this means is, certain factors exist in every work. I I would change that, not just a workplace, but really any environment, regardless of if it's job or not. Any environment that causes dissatisfaction, right? Certain factors exist there, while yet another set of factors cause dissatisfaction, and they can all act independent of each other. So just to help paint a better picture here, when we talk about hygiene factors, these are the environmental and contextual factors, external, right? So for job, that would be salary, working conditions, company policies, that sort of thing. For motivators, these could be more intrinsic factors related to uh, the task, or the job at hand, right? Are there any levels of recognition, responsibilities that you as an individual get to take on, aside from working in a group that has some responsibilities, but do you as an individual, are you being tasked with anything? Is there any opportunities for growth and upward mobility? Those are the kinds of things when we talk about motivators versus hygiene. And basically, this wonderful work here was done on a study in the 50s, and he basically asked employees to describe instances in which they felt particularly satisfied or dissatisfied. And one of the criticisms often you might often hear with dual factor theory is that it's often focusing on individual factors rather than contextual factors. So what I mean by that is there's often a reluctance to address, sort of other societal factors at play that are outside of, your small collective unit, right? Yes, you work at this place and there's a job there, but is there a government strife or war happening at the same time that you're also in your job? Those things do, in fact, even though they're on a more global scale, they absolutely impact both motivators and hygiene factors. So that's one of the biggest criticisms of this. I see it more of a sort of a rough tool belt, a tool in your tool belt to paint a really rough picture. And then, of course, you apply external context as necessary, but it's nonetheless, it is still a very good social psychology tool to use to understand individual and group dynamics. Uh, Theory X and Theory Y leadership. There's also quite a bit of controversy around this, but I really when we talk about McGregor, he ultimately summarizes that there's sort of two ways of approaching people, and really it's the way that a manager's attitude, exists, both in front of their direct uh, cohort, on which they are they have authority over, as well as among peers. That behavior and attitude has direct and indirect impacts on employee motivation. There's a book there, you can check it out. But McGregor really talks about theory X attitude of a manager, assumes that the manager sees employees valuing the amount of money they make as their primary source of motivation. They Theory X attitude is one where, work is inherently distasteful because it takes time that they otherwise could have been spent doing something else that they value more. So, Theory X attitude assumes that people will attempt to avoid work whenever possible, and that certainly is true for some circumstances. But again, my personal take on it is really the vast majority of the time that is not the case. Um, Theory X also assumes most people are not ambitious, meaning they want to do as little as possible for the most amount of reward. Some cases that is true, oftentimes it is not. It argues that there is little desire for responsibility, and this attitude prefers to see people as needing to be directed, and it sees people as having no creative aptitude in solving problems. Oftentimes the way I've seen Theory X frameworks be used effectively is if there's a particularly difficult team member involved. Usually it's an individual, just and sometimes implementing these levels of control and direct, purview can in fact be effective. Oftentimes though, it's not. Um, and if we take a look at the Theory X toolkit, we can very clearly see why. So talk about coercion, right? Forced ways of being, micromanagement, implicit threats, right? In the case of a job, firing them, tight controls over work, that sort of thing. Nonetheless, it's effective in its own right in very certain circumstances. Now, on the other hand, theory Y attitude, you're assuming that most people are competent and they are creative enough to essentially fix their own problems and achieve the goals that they were tasked with. You also have a more positive overview in that people are capable of handling responsibility, and it's because you see them as being committed not only to the quality of the job, but also because they feel like it's satisfying their higher needs, and by needs, we're talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're also viewing people in a way that they can be self-directed, where you don't need such tight levels of control, and really you can just allow people to naturally organize themselves and work it out. And of course, if this is equally applicable when we talk about, uh, you know, adults versus children. Toolkit same toolkit applies, but you'll use it based on the situation and circumstances. So when we take a look at the 3Y toolkit, you'll find most of it is hands off, very decentralized. So decentralized method of command, a lot of delegating of tasks, enlarging the by job enlargement. We're talking about not scope creep, but we are talking about explaining and helping people understand, and assuming that people also understand how their one project or their task is really um, interconnected in this whole giant machine and system, as opposed to, being isolated and not involved in any way. So, and it also makes heavy use of participative management, where you're actively seeking out feedback from and engagement from your team members, as opposed to waiting or waiting for a response from them or forcing them to give a response. It's much more natural. Now, interestingly enough, Oichi, so again, he was a American researcher, and it was at the time where the Japanese automakers were really outshining American automakers. And when we talk about Oichi's Theory Z, really what he's doing is he's taking a sort of hybrid of the two, but expanding on it even more. And a Theory Z attitude is really emphasizing that. Uh, Employees across the entire organization, when you give them a high degree of freedom and trust, they're going to do the right thing. And they're going to take responsibility, and they're effectively going to self-organize. And not only because it's in their own best interest, but because they see it as in the best interest of others as well as the company to do quality work. It emphasizes consensual decision making, long-term employment, slow sometimes, and data-driven evaluation and promotion, as well as more holistic and humanistic concern of employees. You're not just looking at people as, well, people hate work, they only do it for money, therefore you have to control them. And, on the other extreme, people are always, every time, always committed to quality and doing their best. And you just totally never engage them anyway, and they'll do their own thing in a constructive manner to the company and the team. This is more realistic. This is really how it is just about everywhere. And the holistic part of it is that if we go back just really quickly to Hertzberg's dual factor theory, right? All of these things are one of the criticisms we talked about was how it's focused on um, contextual factors just for the individual. Well, and it neglects environmental factors for what's going on in society and the world at large. Theory Z really turns it on its head, and it adds that missing component where you talk about not only what's going on in the world, but what's going on potentially in the lives of the individuals that make up your team and your organization. You're really getting to know your customers on an intimate level rather than doing nonsensical um, surveys. You're doing a lot of research in understanding, how is it that digital transformation is really impacting supply chain? Why is it that we need UNS architecture built on the four principles of report by exception, lightweight, open architecture, right? Why is it that we need to do it this way versus our point-to-point um, integration? That's really where Theory Z uh, frameworks shine and are able to do some of that deeper dive. It also has a much higher bias for action, even though sometimes that bias can be more dependent in valuing of data to show why we should do something. It is still a bias for action as opposed to a lot of the methods that people are familiar with plan, do, check, act, right? The Deming way of sequential waterfall project management. We talked a little bit about this, right? Implicit and explicit biases in project management. All this to say, um, biases do not just come from culture. It's really driven by physiological responses, which is to say that you have to have a mastery of neuroscience, understand what potential um, events, what potential incidents people might have come across before, and how they view the project, the world today at large, right? You need to understand those things if you want to have a successful outcome. These biases exist not out of thin air, but oftentimes through subconscious means. And it's bringing those subconscious things into the forefront and exploring them to help train people out of certain negative purviews and working towards a common goal and learning a new adaptive way of being. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about bias overall, especially in project management. One of the ways that you can really quickly identify bias in project management is before the actual project even starts. If we look at, if you recall in our first video about what is project management, right? The charter actually marks the birth of the project, but the business case document is where you can actually start seeing potential avenues where bias will rear its head, implicitly or explicitly, right? Because business case documents are really just taking a look at the problem at large. They're not proposing a solution. There is no time bound anything. There's no budget or sponsor or anything like that, right? Doesn't formally exist at all as a project, but it shows how people are viewing the problem at hand. Is it really true that that is the problem? Or is it currently just how the organization or the team thinks about the problem? That will definitely give you a huge window into further, not only further complications on the road, but potential lenses of bias that you as an individual, your team, your organization as a whole might be viewing something. So the business case document is a great, great place to go always for getting a kickstart on understanding some of these biases. This is a slide. I actually want to do a little deeper dive into. Now, I've shown before, right, the different organizational structure types, and I just want to do a deeper dive and sort of explain not each of these columns and each of the structure types. Again, the most important takeaway here is that there is no such thing as the best organizational structure. You adapt the structure as well as your management techniques that best fit your needs at the present moment, and you simply iterate accordingly. You might have heard continuous improvement. This is a facet of that. Until such time that you reach a lighthouse moment, right? Where, we take a look at our innovation graph, sort of an S, and it plateaus at some point. And then the lighthouse moment is where innovation occurs, where it's the same game, but the rules are totally different. You jump up a step. That is what um, still applies today, and I just wanted um, to readdress that here. Another thing, again, just to reiterate, what's different from humans in particular to all other life forms is that it's we have the innate ability to instantaneously create and change social structures to meet the current need. Meaning, what we do today is a function of what we know how to do now. But as we, create new things and do the work, we're going to learn along the way, and it means we need to adapt and change along the way. And so those two things I want you to keep at the forefront, and those are the two lenses you should be viewing this chart from. Because if you cannot view it from those, then this chart really just becomes more of a, well, which one is the best one? And it's not at all what this chart is intended to do. So now that we have that, if we take a look at this list, at the top left, we see organic or simple. A lot of times you'll see this type of dominance hierarchy within startup companies where people are wearing many different hats. There might not necessarily be a lot of expectations on one person to meet certain specific tasks. We just know that the end goal is X, and really people are allowed to self-organize and achieve that. What it means for a project manager, again, because there's no real defined dominance hierarchy, they don't really have an authoritative role. They might not even be existent in the company. And whether you need one or not really depends on areas that you've as a leader as well as a project team member have seen as a need that other folks have might just not able to rise to the occasion because they might not have those project management skills to help resolve those issues. That's primarily where you see the sort of organic or simple structure, or as I'm really more aptly like to call it, dominance hierarchy. When we take a look at the next one, functional, this is specific task, specific responsibility, and you're limited to just that task, right? You have a safety engineer that specifically handles checking safety PLCs at a specific point in time, and that's all they do. That's all they do. Who do they report to? They report to functional manager. And is there really a need for a project manager? A lot of times, no. Oftentimes, not even necessary. That person or persons who have that specific job title carry out that task. They do it routinely, and there's no need for supervision outside of them reporting, letting others know that the functional task was done. As you sort of climb up in sometimes yeah, and I also want to make the distinction here that it's not like these are going up or down in organizational size, right? So it's not like when you go from organic to functional, you're increasing your corporate size. It's not guaranteed at all. Um, but really what it means is that, you know, a lot of times you'll see some structures in some environments versus others. So when we talk about multi-divisional, right, a lot of times this is a company that's just selling many products of a similar product family line. Um, and there's not really much actual project management or projects occurring. They already have their products and they just need assistance with managing the production of the products, and they already have the means to produce those products down pat. So, you know, they might have a distribution center here, but their actual production facility is elsewhere. Do they really need a project manager for that? Or can it simply be, again, in this case, a functional manager that oversees one task of the delivery, and then another one who simply sees the task of the consumption of the raw goods, and then another task of, safety engineer managing the safety of the production of that good or goods. Another dominance hierarchy you might see is a strong matrix where people are organized by their job function, and project management is a job function, right? People are doing, this is often the case where you see people doing operational work, and those people are separated from project work, where oftentimes you might bring in outside vendors to actually do dedicated project work, and you have other staff that are doing operational work, right? Day-to-day maintenance tasks. In this case, project manager has a very high level of authority. and rightfully so, right? If they're being brought on for a project, that means time bound, it's unique. There's a specific budget allocated just to that project. Weak matrix, on the other hand, um, it's a similar to a strong matrix, but really weak in the sense when we talk about strong, it's not, strong as in it's better. It just means that the level of authority of a project manager, right? Strong matrix organization, you'll see project manager having a higher authority than not. Um, Same thing with the balanced. Uh, Interesting one out of these is the project oriented. So really, oftentimes you only see this with construction companies, general contractors. They essentially live and die by project work, right? They're brought on to do a project, they build it. That's pretty much it. Sometimes if they might have some vertically integrated services, building services, consulting services, that sort of thing. They might be brought on for that. Otherwise, though, most of the time, they're brought on just to do a project. That's primarily where you see it. Um, then let's see here. You'll have virtual work. So, this is very common now with, um, you know, virtual team members. The fact that a lot of our team members are scattered all over the world. Uh, can make it very difficult. Hierarchies, responsibilities, expectations, who has um, authority. It can be challenging. It's very, very varied, to say the least. The PMO, it's it's a difficult one. We'll actually cover it in a next slide, but the PMO, aka the Project Management Office, has changed quite a bit over the years. Um, so let's go ahead and talk about it. So the formal definition of a PMO, right? Very convoluted. I mean, I've read it through it a couple of times, but organizational structure that standardizes the project related governance processes and facilitates the sharing of resources, methodologies, tools, and techniques. It's quite a handful. There's a lot of PMI isms in there, and you can read through some of the slides here, but really what I want to highlight here is really two things. There's three really types of a PMO: supportive, controlling, directive. They do their own thing, namely supportive. Um, they're more or less like information brokers. They don't really have any authority. They give you access to resources, like kind of like a library. Controlling, oftentimes they might be a regulatory compliance body within the company, and you have to use a specific template or form, especially if you do business in some areas, just because of the fact that there's legal consequences if you don't. Um, And then directive is they have it's more like bringing in consultants, but your consultants are internal, and you're sectioning out a group of people that normally have functional job tasks and responsibilities, but for this allotted period of time, they're going to forego those responsibilities and only look at this particular project work. Really, how a PMO came about is prior to the day and age of the internet era, you needed to have information and communications brokers because real-time communications were essentially non-existent. You needed to essentially have somebody riding on horseback, more or less, and letting people know that the project work is done or the project work in this particular phase. Uh, that's really why it existed. I think the thing a lot of organizations are struggling with now is justifying the existence of a PMO. Do we actually need it? And frankly, I have yet to see a PMO be effectively utilized in this day and age, primarily due to factors in digital transformation, right? People are empowered to be self-reliant and seek out their own information. So do they really need this entity that you're actively funding and paying money for where instead people can just seek out their own information. Uh, it's really hard to, in this day and age, justify the existence of a PMO. I think a lot of times you'll see it transformed again into a regulatory compliance body, where out of sheer legal necessity they exist, but they don't really do much work other than that. Oftentimes, it's the work of a PMO is often outsourced. It's not called a PMO specifically, but you might see it again as some sort of management consulting, specifically for either some to do some market research analysis or to do again some sort of regulatory compliance work. But even the folks that do uh, contract out this PMO work of market research, a lot of that is going away, and I think rightfully so, thanks to digital transformation. Everybody has access to real-time information, and they can historize it. And for themselves, they can see not only how their company is doing, but relative to others. How are those companies doing? It's tough, you know. The days of the PMO, I think personally, are rightfully dwindling down, and it had a purpose. It served that purpose when it was necessary and appropriate. But I think, a PMO will continue existing, just not in the same way that we're sort of used to. I think by and large, you're just going to see it exclusively be utilized as a regulatory compliance type of structure. And oftentimes it might not even be internally. So, just things to keep in mind. So if you made it this far, we're at the conclusion. And I always like to leave a little slide here as a pop quiz. Um, and what we'll go ahead and through each of these just very briefly. So, and I'll refer to the slides for where you can find this information. So, you know, just to recap, we learned about the Tuckman's stages of group development. We learned about the parts of the brain. We learned about some social psychologists. We learned about biases, and we learned about how our nervous system operates, right? These are really the things that at the core make up leadership management, right? Neuroscience is driving the understanding of leadership and management, not platitudes, not vapid, you know, useless comments about, how somebody should or shouldn't be, but really driven at the core of uh, physiological responses, how those physiological responses affect behavior, drive thoughts, so on and so forth, right? So taking a look at the first one, the Tuckman stages of group development, we have this beautiful picture. But the thing you won't see here is the iterative part. So hopefully you can pick up on that, right? So obviously, I mentioned before you can go through these in sequential order, but just after performing here is the iterative step of norming and renorming, where you know, what you know now is a function of what you've done. So that's why there's that iterative part of the stages of group development. 3 parts of the brain. So this is all the way back to here. So we have the cortex, and of course, there's more parts of the cortex. There's our reptilian brain and our limbic system. 3Y management means extreme control and discipline of employees. True or false? You should obviously answer false. And we'll go ahead and this is McGregor we're talking about. Right, if we take a look at the toolkit, it's actually decentralization and delegation. And you believe people are self-directed and can align their work with the organization's goals. What is the purpose of the business case documents? We actually mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it is to quickly understand bias, both implicit and explicit. And lastly, name the two nervous systems. So this would be PNS, CNS. And here we have the way that the information travels. I believe, though, the PNS, CNS, right here, Neuroscience 101. Great. I hope this video was helpful. I know it's quite a lot of information, but now you truly have the foundational knowledge to understand human behavior individually and collectively, and you know, understanding it from a scientific point of view, true empirical evidence, as opposed to cultural anecdotes or, vapid platitudes you might have heard. This is really what's driving management and leadership. And the folks that are effective leaders are also effective managers. And the folks that are truly effective managers are also effective leaders. You need all of this, and you need a mastery of neuroscience and human psychology, social psychology, brain development to be able to really key in and use some of these frameworks uh, appropriately and situationally. So stay tuned for the next video, and I will see you guys on the next one. All right.